They never caught the men who killed his wife. That's how this story starts. Not with a hero, not with a bang. It starts with a man named Harlan Graves, a man who lost everything he ever loved and still had to wake up the next morning. And the morning after that, for 10 long years. When you see evil like that, up close, it doesn't just fade away. It's not a memory, it's a poison. It seeps into your coffee. It whispers in your dreams. It turns a perfect blue sky into a shade of ash. So for a decade, Harlan Graves was just a ghost with a shovel, a ranch hand who didn't talk much, didn't smile, and sure as hell didn't trust anyone. All he wanted was the silence and the miles of empty desert to keep him company. But the desert has a funny way of holding on to secrets, and it never lets you hide forever. He was out checking fence posts one morning, same as always. Just him, his boots, the dust, and his hat pulled down low. He was cussing at the wind when he saw it, a little flash of white just off the ridge. Probably just a piece of cloth, he figured, or maybe a dead animal the coyotes hadn't found yet. He got closer. The flies were buzzing, thick and angry. It wasn't cloth, and it wasn't an animal. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 20, wrapped in something that might have once been a blanket, now just a dirty rag. Her skin was blistered from the sun, caked with dirt. She wasn't moving. For a second, Harlan's heart hammered against his ribs, a feeling so old he barely recognized it. He thought she was dead, and Harlan, a man who hadn't willingly touched another soul in 10 years, knelt down in the dust. He reached out a hand, slow, hesitant. That's when her eyes shot open. They were wild with terror. She whispered 4 words, and those 4 words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air clean out of his lungs. "Don't touch me there." He froze, his hand hovering in the air. His eyes traced the words down to her body. And that's when he saw it all. The bruises blooming like dark flowers on her skin. The swollen belly, tight and round beneath the rags. And the blood, dried and cracked like old paint. She wasn't just hurt. She was pregnant. And someone had tried to beat the child right out of her. In that instant, the last 10 years collapsed into nothing. The grief, the numbness, the silence, it all burned away. He was staring into the same abyss that had swallowed his wife. The same kind of monsters were still out there, walking in the sun. And just like that, Harlan Graves remembered what it felt like to hate. He remembered what it felt like to care. He remembered what it felt like to kneel beside someone who's been shattered and know that words are useless. Only action, only fire, only justice. That day, Harlan didn't just find a girl in the desert. He found a reason to clean his rifle. He found a reason to fight. And for the first time in a decade, he wasn't afraid of what came next. He was waiting for it. The cabin wasn't much, just a crooked roof that leaked when it rained hard, a busted door that never quite shut right, and one window that whistled a lonely tune when the wind picked up. But it was safe. It was quiet. And for the girl, it might as well have been a castle. He learned her name was Lenora. She didn't speak that first day. She just sat in the old wooden chair by the fireplace, wrapped in a thick wool blanket that smelled like cedar and horse sweat. She stared into the flames, her eyes seeing things Harlan couldn't. He didn't push her. He just brewed a pot of strong coffee, heated up a can of stew, and tossed her a pair of his thickest wool socks. They didn't match. Then he went outside to split firewood, acting like his whole world hadn't just been turned upside down. But the truth was, everything had changed. He hadn't let another living soul sit in that chair since his wife, Sarah, had died. It was her chair. Now this girl, this stranger, sat there, her face half hidden in the shadows, her hands trembling every time a log popped in the fire. Before he stepped out into the cold evening air, he did something he hadn't done in years. He walked over to the old wooden chest at the foot of his bed. The lid creaked open, releasing the faint scent of lavender and dust. Inside, folded perfectly, was a simple prairie dress, worn but clean, blue as a summer sky. It was Sarah's. He laid it gently on the table next to Lenora. His voice was rough, like stones scraping together. "It belonged to my wife," he said. "If it fits, it's yours." He didn't wait for an answer. He just turned and walked out, closing the busted door behind him. Later that night, huddled by the dying fire, she finally spoke. Her voice was a bare whisper, cracked and broken. She didn't tell him a story. She gave him pieces, shards of a nightmare, a place called El Paso, a promise of work, wrong people. She'd choke on the words every time she tried to say what they'd done to her. So he stopped her. He didn't need to hear it. He could see it in the hollows of her eyes. He already knew that kind of evil. When she whispered that she couldn't trust anyone, not anymore, Harlan didn't get offended. He just nodded, staring into the flames with her. Ain't many folks worth trustin', he said, and for the first time, a tiny ghost of a smile touched her lips. It was barely there, but it was a start. The next morning he found her standing barefoot on the porch, staring out at his two horses as they grazed in the pale morning light. She looked so small against the vast, empty landscape. Small and tired, but the terror in her eyes was gone, replaced by something else, something harder. She heard his footsteps on the creaking wood and turned. Her voice was quiet, but clear. Why didn't you leave me out there? You could have. Harlan didn't answer right away. He just watched the sun slowly climb over the jagged ridge in the distance, painting the sky in strokes of orange and pink. He leaned against the porch rail, the old wood groaning under his weight. Reckon I've left enough people behind for one lifetime, he finally said. Ain't planning on doing it again. Lenora didn't cry, but he saw something shift in her face. It was like a heavy weight she'd been carrying for 1,000 miles had finally been set down. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up to her ears, relaxed just a fraction. That day was different. She helped him stack the firewood he'd split. She ate a full bowl of stew without him having to coax her. And that night, she slept for 6 hours straight without waking up screaming. She was still broken. He knew that. You don't walk away from that kind of hell hole. But he could see something starting to stitch itself back together inside her, a tiny flicker of a flame in the darkness. But Harlan was an old man, and he knew one thing for certain. The kind of men who did this to her, they weren't the kind to give up. They wouldn't stop looking. And he knew with a cold certainty that settled deep in his bones that sooner or later they'd come knocking on his busted old door. He was going to be ready. But as he watched her from the porch, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. As she reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, the sleeve of the old wool shirt he'd given her slipped down her arm. And there, on the delicate skin of her inner wrist, was a mark. It wasn't a bruise. It wasn't a scar. It was a brand, a small, intricate symbol seared into her flesh, a snake eating its own tail, forming a perfect circle. Harlan's blood ran cold. He'd seen that mark before, years ago, in a place he'd tried his whole life to forget. This wasn't random. This girl hadn't just run into wrong people. She had run from someone very specific, and they were connected to his past in a way that made the hair on his neck stand up. The quiet life he had tried to build was over. The war he thought he'd left behind had just found him again. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. It was the kind of peace you get in the eye of a storm, a fragile silence that feels like it could shatter at any moment. Lenora stopped flinching every time he walked into a room. She started sleeping through the night, the nightmares seemingly kept at bay by the sturdy walls of his old cabin. He started teaching her things, practical things, how to hold a hammer without smashing your thumb, how to properly sight down the barrel of a rifle, to hold it steady, to squeeze the trigger, not pull it. He told her it was for hunting rabbits. They both knew he was lying. In return, she taught him how to make biscuits that didn't have the texture of a roofing shingle. She even got him to laugh once, a rusty creaking sound he hadn't heard from his own throat in a decade. For a few fleeting moments, it felt like something was healing. Not just her wounds, but his too. The cold, empty space in his chest felt a little warmer. The ghost of his wife, Sarah, felt less like a painful memory and more like a quiet, approving presence. But trouble doesn't send a letter to announce its arrival. It just shows up on your doorstep, uninvited. It was a Tuesday morning. The sky was clear and painfully bright. Harlan was out by the old water pump, trying to fix a leak, when he noticed the crows. There were 5 of them, circling low over the eastern ridge. Way too low. Crows are smart scavengers. They don't circle like that unless something is dead, or about to be. He shielded his eyes, his gaze following their lazy, circling path. His hand, greasy from the pump, instinctively moved to rest on the butt of the pistol he always wore on his hip. His rifle was leaning against the porch rail, just a few feet away. Always close, always ready. And that's when he saw it. A glint, a tiny, brilliant flash of light from the top of the ridge. Not a rock, not a piece of glass. It was the sun hitting polished metal, a spyglass, or the barrel of a rifle. Someone was out there, watching them. Harlan didn't run. He hadn't run from a fight since the war, and he wasn't about to start now. He just slowly, deliberately, wiped his hands on his pants and stepped back inside the cabin. He moved with a calm, practiced grace, his movements economical and precise. He picked up his rifle, the weight of it familiar and comforting in his hands. He checked the load. Lenora was in the kitchen humming a tune he didn't recognize. She was kneading dough for biscuits, her hands covered in flour. She looked up and smiled when he came in, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. It was the first one he'd ever seen from her. And then the first shot cracked through the morning air. The sound was like a whip, sharp and violent. The bullet slammed into the wooden frame of the porch, splintering the old timber just inches from the doorway. Lenora screamed, a raw, terrified sound that ripped through the peaceful morning. The bowl of dough fell from her hands, hitting the floor with a wet smack. Harlan didn't flinch. He just raised his rifle, aimed high at the ridge, and fired back once. He wasn't trying to hit anything. He was just sending a message. The shooting from the ridge stopped. Then a voice, amplified by the vast emptiness of the desert, echoed down into the valley. It was too far to see the face of the man shouting, but the words were crystal clear, carried on the wind. "Graves! We know she's in there. That girl is ours. We're coming for her." Then nothing. Just silence. The kind of heavy, ringing silence that follows a loud noise. The crows scattered, their harsh cries fading into the distance. Lenora slid to the floor, her back against the wall, her body trembling uncontrollably. All the progress, all the healing of the past few days was gone. The terror was back, stark and absolute. Harlan gently closed the cabin door, the busted latch clicking into place. He turned to her, his face a grim, unreadable mask. "Get some water," he said, his voice low and steady. "And bar the window. We're not done yet." By nightfall, the ranch looked like a fortress. Harlan had worked with a furious, focused energy. He'd set up tripwires made of thin, almost invisible wire, connected to a series of old tin cans that would rattle if disturbed. He'd dug a shallow trench behind the woodshed, a perfect little foxhole. He'd positioned lanterns under barrels, rigged to flare up if a line was pulled, turning the night into day for a few crucial seconds. Every move was calculated. Every knot was tied with purpose. He was a man possessed. He had been preparing for a day like this, a day when the wolves would come to his door, ever since the last pack had taken everything from him. And this time, he wasn't planning on losing. The wind howled that night, a mournful, lonely sound that scraped against the cabin walls. It was as if the desert itself knew what was coming. It knew blood was about to be spilled on its thirsty ground. Lenora was huddled by the fire, the shotgun he'd given her resting across her lap. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were fixed on the door, her jaw set. The broken girl was gone. In her place was a survivor. Harlan sat in the shadows, his rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the darkness outside the single window. His breathing was slow and even. His hands were steady. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a soldier again, waiting for the battle to begin. They came just before midnight. He didn't see them at first. He heard them, the soft, rhythmic thud of horse hooves on the dry earth, muffled by the howling wind. Then, the faint metallic click of a rifle being cocked. There were two of them. No words, no warnings. They were professionals. But Harlan was ready. The first one tried to circle around the back, toward the woodshed, probably thinking the old man would be focused on the front door. Big mistake. His boots snagged the tripwire. The tin cans clattered, a sound like a rattlesnake's warning. At the same instant, the hidden lantern flared to life, illuminating him in a sudden, brilliant halo of light. Harlan was already moving. He fired once from the window. The shot was deafening inside the small cabin. The man in the light crumpled to the ground without a sound. One down. The second man was smarter, or maybe just angrier. He came straight for the barn, fast and loud, kicking the doors open with a crash. He probably thought he could scare the old man, make him panic. Harlan stepped out onto the porch, melting into the deep shadows. The gunfight lasted maybe 5 seconds. 6 at the most. A muzzle flash from the barn, a second flash from the porch, a third, a grunt of pain, then silence. Long enough for one man to lie bleeding out in the hay and for the other to walk away. Harlan stood there for a moment, listening to the wind. Blood was trickling down his side, a hot, sticky trail. His shirt was already sticking to the wound. It was just a graze, but it burned like fire. He didn't have time for pain. Not yet. He dragged the bodies out past the ridge, his boots leaving deep furrows in the dirt. He was methodical. He took their boots and their guns. He set fire to their coats, watching the flames lick at the fabric until they were nothing but ash. He buried the bodies in shallow graves, not bothering with a marker. He salted the earth above them, an old superstition. Then he covered his tracks, using a broken branch to sweep away the signs of his work. When he was done, he leaned on his shovel, breathing heavily, the pain in his side a dull, insistent throb. He looked up at the cold, indifferent stars and whispered something into the night. It wasn't a prayer for the dead. It was a promise to the living. No one's coming for her again. He stumbled back to the cabin, a dark trail of blood marking his path. He collapsed just inside the door, the rifle clattering to the floor beside him. Lenora found him there, his face pale as a ghost in the moonlight, his breathing shallow. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. The girl who had been shattered by violence now faced it with a strange, cold calm. She just knelt beside him, tore a strip from her dress, and pressed it hard against the wound, her small hand surprisingly strong. She held his hand, her grip tight and unwavering, as the first pale light of dawn broke over the horizon. Harlan didn't die that night. The bleeding was bad, and the fever that followed was worse, but he pulled through. Maybe it was just pure, cantankerous stubbornness, or maybe it was something else, something he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to live. As he lay there, drifting in and out of a feverish haze, he examined the man he'd shot in the barn. Before he dragged him out, he'd searched his pockets. He found a half-empty flask of whiskey, a few coins, and a folded piece of paper. It was a wanted poster. The drawing was crude but unmistakable. It was Lenora. The poster described her as a thief and a runaway, property of the Kane family, and the bounty for her return, dead or alive, was enough to buy a man a small ranch of his own. But that wasn't the most chilling part. At the bottom of the poster, printed small but clear, was a symbol, a snake eating its own tail, the same symbol that was branded on her wrist. He stared at it, the pieces clicking into place with a horrifying certainty. The Kane family. He knew that name. They were a blight on the territory, a powerful, ruthless clan that owned nearly everything from El Paso to the state line. They bought what they couldn't steal, and they killed what they couldn't buy. And 10 years ago, his wife Sarah had refused to sell them their small plot of land. She'd stood up to them. A week later, she was dead. They called it a robbery gone wrong. Harlan had always known better. He just couldn't prove it. This wasn't just about saving a girl anymore. The men who had come for Lenora, they weren't just bounty hunters. They were the same breed of snake that had poisoned his life a decade ago. He was in a fever dream, but his path forward was suddenly crystal clear. He wasn't just protecting Lenora. He was finally getting his revenge. When the fever broke, Harlan opened his eyes to find Lenora sitting on the porch, the shotgun still resting across her lap. She was watching the horizon, her gaze sharp and vigilant. She had been his nurse, his guard, his lifeline. She'd changed his bandages, forced broth down his throat, and stood watch every single night. The roles had reversed. The survivor was now the protector. Weeks turned into a month. His wound healed, leaving a ragged scar on his side. Her belly grew, a gentle, swelling curve that was a constant reminder of the life they were protecting. The quiet rhythm returned, but it was different now. It wasn't fragile anymore. It was forged in shared danger, tempered by blood and gunpowder. He saw the brand on her wrist one afternoon as she was hanging laundry. He finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. The Kane family, he said, his voice flat. What did you take from them? She froze, her hand still holding a wet sheet. She didn't look at him. She stared at the brand on her skin, her expression hardening. My life, she whispered. And his. She placed a hand on her belly. Then the story came pouring out, not in pieces this time, but in a flood. She hadn't just been with the wrong people. She had been married to the youngest Kane son, a cruel, sadistic man named Jasper. It wasn't a marriage of love. She was property, a transaction to settle a debt her father owed. The brand was their mark of ownership. The baby she carried was the next heir to the Kane Empire, an empire built on fear and blood. She had run, not just to save herself, but to save her child from being born into that monstrous legacy. Harlan listened, his face like stone. But inside, a cold, calculated rage was building. He finally understood. They wouldn't stop coming. Sending 2 men was just the beginning. The Kanes didn't tolerate loose ends. They would send an army if they had to. His small ranch, once his sanctuary, was now a trap. They couldn't stay. That afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, not a bounty hunter. The man wore a tin star on his chest, Sheriff Brody, a man Harlan knew to be as crooked as a dog's hind leg. Brody rode up slow, his eyes taking in everything. The new wood on the porch where the bullet had hit, the faint scorch mark on the ground near the barn. He tipped his hat, a greasy smile on his face. Harlan, he said, his voice slick as oil. Heard some commotion out this way the other night. Just checking to make sure everything's all right. Just some coyotes, Harlan said, his hand resting near his pistol. Took care of them. Brody's eyes narrowed, shifting to the cabin door, where Lenora had disappeared inside. Coyotes, huh? Funny. Heard different. Heard you might have some company that belongs to Silas Kane. The game was over. The law wasn't coming to help. The law was on their payroll. You tell Silas, Harlan said, his voice dropping to a low growl, that whatever he lost is gone for good, and if he sends anyone else to my door, I'll send them back in pieces. Brody's smile vanished. That's a big mistake, Graves. You're an old man. He's an empire. You can't win this fight. He spurred his horse, turning back toward town. He'll be coming for you, he called over his shoulder. With everyone. Harlan watched him go, the dust settling in his wake. He knew Brody was right. He couldn't win. Not here. Not by defending. He turned and walked back into the cabin. Lenora was standing there, her face pale, the shotgun gripped tight in her hands. Pack a bag, Harlan said. Just the essentials. We're leaving. Leaving? She asked, her voice trembling. Where will we go? Harlan looked around the small cabin, the only home he'd known for 30 years. He looked at the chair where Sarah used to sit. He was about to lose it all over again. But this time was different. This time he wasn't just losing something. He was fighting for something. He turned back to her, and for the first time she saw a fire in his eyes she hadn't seen before. It wasn't just anger. It was purpose. We're not running, he said. We're hunting. They left that night, under the cover of a moonless sky. Just 2 horses, 2 rifles, and a single bag of supplies. They rode east, away from the ranch, away from the life Harlan had known. The desert swallowed them whole, their tracks erased by the night wind. For days they were ghosts. They traveled by night and hid during the brutal heat of the day, finding shelter in rocky outcrops and hidden canyons. Harlan knew from his years of solitude. He pushed them hard, his face a grim mask of determination. He knew Silas Kane would have men scouring the territory, a web of hunters closing in around them. During those long, silent days, hiding from the sun, they talked. He told her about Sarah, about the life they'd built and the way it had been stolen from them. She told him more about the Kanes, about their sprawling, fortified compound they called the Citadel. She described the inner workings of their brutal family, the fear they used to control everyone around them. She also told him about something she'd taken when she fled, something more valuable than her life. It was a small, leather-bound ledger. She had it wrapped in oilcloth, hidden at the very bottom of her meager bag. It was Jasper's private journal, filled with his father's business dealings. Every crooked land deal, every bribe paid to men like Sheriff Brody, every murder ordered to remove an obstacle. It was all there, recorded in Jasper's meticulous, arrogant script. He was proud of it, she whispered, her voice filled with disgust. He called it the family history. This ledger was the reason they were so desperate to find her. It wasn't just about the baby, it was about the book. It was the key that could bring their entire empire crashing down. Their journey led them to a dusty, forgotten town called Redemption, a place little more than a single street and a handful of weathered buildings. Harlan knew someone there. An old army doctor named Miller, a man who had patched him up during the war. He figured they could get some medical supplies for Lenora and a hot meal before disappearing again. Doc Miller's office was cluttered and smelled of antiseptic and old paper. The doctor himself was a stooped, white-haired man with kind eyes. He remembered Harlan instantly, greeting him with a warm, if surprised, handshake. He asked no questions about Lenora, simply tending to her swollen ankles and giving her a tonic for her fatigue. He insisted they stay for dinner. He offered them the spare room in the back of his clinic to rest for the night. The desert is no place for a woman in her condition, he'd said, his voice full of fatherly concern. For the first time in days, Harlan let his guard down. The kindness felt real. The small clinic felt safe, an island of civilization in a sea of hostility. It was a foolish mistake. As Harlan was getting ready to leave the next morning, thanking the doctor for his hospitality, he noticed something odd. Doc Miller seemed nervous, his hands fidgeting. He kept glancing out the front window toward the main street. He was stalling, making idle conversation, trying to keep them there. Harlan's internal alarm, the one that had kept him alive for so long, started screaming. He walked to the window and peered through the dusty glass. At the far end of the street, 3 riders were dismounting. They weren't cowboys. They moved with the cold efficiency of hunters, their hands never straying far from their guns. And on the saddle of the lead horse, Harlan could see the glint of a silver emblem, a snake eating its own tail. He turned slowly, his eyes locking with Doc Miller's. The kindness was gone from the old man's face, replaced by a mask of pure terror and shame. "They promised they wouldn't hurt you," the doctor stammered, his voice a pathetic whine. "They have my son. They said they'd kill him if I didn't send word when you arrived." A trap. The entire town was a trap. The front door of the clinic burst open. 2 of Kane's men stood there, rifles leveled. The third was coming around the back. They were surrounded. "Give us the girl and the book, old man," the leader sneered, "and Kane might let you live." Harlan didn't say a word. He just pushed Lenora behind him. He had his pistol in his hand before the man even finished his sentence. He knew they were outnumbered. He knew they were trapped. But he was done running. The gunfight in Redemption was fast, brutal, and bloody. Harlan kicked over the examination table, creating a makeshift barricade. The first shots exploded in the small room, shattering glass vials and tearing holes in the walls. Lenora, huddled behind the table, wasn't screaming. She was loading the spare pistol with steady hands the way he had taught her. Harlan knew they couldn't win a prolonged fight. Their only chance was chaos. He saw a large shelf filled with glass jars of alcohol and strange chemicals. He fired a single shot into the middle of it. The shelf erupted. Glass shattered, and a wave of flammable liquid splashed across the room. One of the gunmen's lanterns, knocked over in the confusion, ignited the fumes. The room went up in a roar of fire. Smoke and flames filled the clinic. Harlan grabbed Lenora's arm. "The back window! Go!" He provided cover fire, his shots precise and deadly in the swirling chaos. One of Kane's men went down, clutching his chest. The other recoiled, his sleeve on fire. Lenora smashed the back window with a stool and scrambled out into the alley. Harlan was right behind her. They ran, the sounds of shouting and gunfire echoing behind them. They didn't stop until the town of Redemption was a smoldering speck in the distance. They found refuge in a cave, exhausted, smoke-stained, but alive. Lenora was shaken but unhurt. As she caught her breath, Harlan took the ledger from her. It was time he saw exactly what was inside this family history. He sat by the mouth of the cave, the fading light of dusk casting long shadows, and he began to read. Page after page detailed a legacy of pure evil, bribes to judges, intimidation of ranchers, men who had disappeared, listed coldly as problems solved. It was a meticulous record of the Kane family's bloody ascent to power. Harlan's hands were trembling, not from fear, but from a rage so pure and cold, it felt like ice in his veins. He felt like he was staring into the very heart of the darkness that had haunted him for 10 years. And then he found it. Near the back of the book, an entry dated 10 years ago. It was short, almost an afterthought. Homesteader Graves problem solved. Land acquired. Payment rendered to drifters. Cost $200. $200. That's what his wife's life had been worth. That's what his world had been worth. It wasn't a random robbery. It wasn't a senseless act of violence by men who were never caught. It was a business transaction, an item in a ledger, ordered and paid for by Silas Kane. The man who was hunting Lenora was the same man who had murdered his wife. In that moment, something inside Harlan Graves snapped. The grief he had carried for a decade didn't just burn away. It crystallized. It turned into something hard and sharp and unbreakable. He closed the ledger, the leather creaking in the silence of the cave. He looked over at Lenora, who was watching him, her eyes wide with a silent understanding. The hunt was over. Now the war would begin. He was no longer the prey. He was the predator, and he was going to dismantle Silas Kane's empire, piece by bloody piece, until there was nothing left but dust and echoes. It wasn't just for Lenora anymore. It wasn't just for the baby. This was for Sarah. The desert that had once been Harlan's refuge now became his weapon. He knew its secrets, its hidden paths, its cruel and unforgiving nature. And he began to use that knowledge not to hide, but to attack. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a ghost, a whisper on the wind. He used the information in the ledger like a battle map, striking at the heart of the Kane Empire. He started small, a vital water well for Kane's cattle, sabotaged. A shipment of payroll for Kane's hired guns vanished into thin air. He'd strike at night and be gone by dawn, leaving behind nothing but confusion and fear. He used the Kane's own tactics against them, turning their web of informants and spies into a mess of paranoia and distrust. He left messages, a single page torn from the ledger, pinned to the door of a corrupt foreman, detailing the bribes he'd taken. The man was found hanging from a tree the next morning, a victim of Kane's ruthless paranoia. Harlan was turning the snake on itself, forcing it to eat its own tail. Stories began to spread among Kane's men. Stories of a phantom in the desert, an old man who couldn't be killed, who moved without a sound and struck without warning. They started deserting, terrified of their own boss, in the ghost that hunted them. Lenora was his partner in this war. Her knowledge of the Kane family was invaluable. She knew their routines, their weaknesses, the cracks in their fortress. She wasn't the broken girl he'd found in the desert anymore. She was a queen fighting to reclaim her child's future from a tyrant. She cleaned the rifles, kept watch, and read the terrain with an intensity that matched his own. Her belly grew larger with each passing week, a silent, ticking clock that spurred them both onward. One evening, studying the ledger, she pointed to a name. "Sheriff Brody," she said. "The book says Kane has something on him, something about his daughter." Harlan remembered the sheriff's greasy smile and his veiled threats. It was time to remove the law from Kane's pocket. They rode to Brody's isolated home, miles from any town. They didn't go in with guns blazing. Harlan waited until Brody was alone, then simply walked up to his front door and knocked. When Brody opened it, his face went white. Harlan didn't threaten him. He didn't raise his voice. He just opened the ledger to a specific page and held it out. It detailed how Kane had paid for a specialist doctor from back east to treat Brody's sick daughter, essentially buying the sheriff's loyalty for life. "Silas Kane doesn't give gifts, Brody," Harlan said, his voice as cold as a grave. "He buys souls. One day the price for his help will come due, and it'll be more than you're willing to pay. You have a choice. You can die a slave for the man who murdered my wife, or you can live as a free man and help me put him in the ground." He left the ledger on the porch and rode away, leaving the terrified sheriff to his conscience. The final target was the Citadel, Silas Kane's fortress. It was a sprawling ranch house built like a fort, surrounded by high walls and defended by the last of his loyal, hardened gunmen. A direct assault would be suicide, but Lenora knew a secret. A forgotten service tunnel, used for drainage, that ran from an old dry well outside the walls directly into the main house's cellar. It hadn't been used in years. It was their way in. The night they chose for the attack, a storm was brewing. The wind howled and dark clouds blotted out the stars. It was perfect. As they prepared, Lenora suddenly gasped, clutching her belly. The baby was coming. There was no turning back now. It was now or never. "You have to go," she said, her face pale with sweat but her eyes burning with resolve. "Finish this, Harlan. For Sarah. For me. For him." She handed him the rifle. "We'll be right here when you get back." Harlan hesitated for only a second. He looked at this incredible, strong woman, the one who had brought purpose back to his empty life. He nodded, a silent promise passing between them. He left her hidden in a secure rock alcove with a pistol and a canteen of water, and then he crawled into the darkness of the tunnel. He emerged into the wine cellar of the main house, silent as a shadow. He could hear the sounds of men drinking and shouting in the great hall above. Using his knowledge of the house layout from Lenora's descriptions, he moved through the darkened corridors like a wraith. He found Silas Kane in his study, a massive, opulent room filled with leather-bound books and hunting trophies. Kane was a big man, with a cruel face and eyes as dead and cold as a shark's. He was pouring himself a brandy, completely unaware of the ghost that had just entered his sanctuary. "Kane," Harlan said. Silas Kane spun around, his hand flying to the pistol on his hip, but Harlan's rifle was already leveled at his heart. "You," Kane snarled, a look of disbelief on his face. "The old rancher. I should have killed you myself 10 years ago." "You did," Harlan said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "The man I was died with my wife. You're looking at what's left." The gunfight was over before it began. Kane was fast, but Harlan was faster. His single shot was the only one that was fired. It was an echo of the shot he'd fired in the barn, the shot he'd fired on the ridge, a final, definitive end. But just as Kane crumpled to the floor, the study doors burst open. Sheriff Brody stood there, flanked by 2 armed deputies. For a heart-stopping second, Harlan thought he'd been betrayed. Brody looked at the body of Silas Kane on the floor. He looked at the ledger Harlan had placed on the desk. Then he looked at Harlan, his face grim. "There was a gunfight," the sheriff said, his voice loud and clear for his men to hear. "Silas Kane resisted arrest and was killed while attempting to flee justice. The old man here was instrumental in bringing this criminal to his end. He had made his choice." When Harlan returned to the hidden alcove, the storm had broken. The air was clean and fresh. He found Lenora not alone, but holding a small, crying bundle wrapped in a piece of her cloak. A baby boy. Harlan knelt down, the rifle slipping from his tired hands. He looked at the child, at Lenora's exhausted, smiling face, and for the first time in over 10 years, the ghost of Harlan Graves felt the warmth of the sun on his skin. The poison was gone. The war was over. They returned to the ranch. It was battered and bruised, much like them, but it was still standing. They rebuilt the broken porch. They fixed the busted door. They planted a new garden where the ground had been scorched by fire. One evening as the sun set, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors he'd watched on that first morning, Harlan carved a new sign for the front gate. It didn't have his name on it. He handed it to Lenora, and she nailed it into place, her hand steady and sure. It read simply, "The Graves Kane Ranch, a new beginning." They stood there watching the last light fade, the old broken man, the young strong woman, and the innocent child who represented a future neither of them had thought possible. Sometimes healing doesn't come quietly. Sometimes it comes like a storm, with thunder and lightning and fire. Sometimes you have to burn down the old world to build a new one on its ashes. This story is about a man who lost everything and a woman who had everything taken from her, and how together, in the middle of all that dust and blood and sorrow, they found a way to build a home. So let me ask you a question. What do you do when the world has given you every reason to give up? Do you let the darkness win, or do you pick up a rifle and fight for the dawn? Let me know what you think down in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, if it made you feel that little spark of hope in the middle of the darkness, then do me a favor. Hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to the channel. We've got a lot more stories to tell. Stories that remind us that even after the longest, darkest night, the sun will always rise again. Thanks for listening.